Hello and welcome everyone to session 7. It's a special keynote address. The session will be taken care of by the speaker, Professor Peggy Levitt. She's a professor and chair of Sociology Department at Wellesley College, U.S.A. The session will be chaired by Professor Saikat Majumdar. He's a professor of English and Creative Writing, Ashoka University. I'll just take a minute to introduce the chair to the session. Saikat Majumdar is a novelist and a scholar. He's professor of English and creative writing at Ashoka University. He has taught previously at Stanford University and was a fellow at the Newhouse Center for Humanities at Wellesley College. He's the author of Prose of the World, Modernism and the Banality of Empire, 2013 and 15. Honorable mention Modernist Studies Association Book Prize in 2014 was given to this book. He's also written a study of modern world literature in English called College. It's a 2018 publication. A general nonfiction on liberal arts education in India, and the co-editor with Arti Vade of a collection of essays called The Critic as Amateur, published in 2019. Saikat has also published 3 novels, most recently The Scent of God in 2019, which was a finalist for the Mathrubhumi Book of the Year Award 2020, and one of Times of India's 20 most talked about Indian novels, Indian books of 2019. He's also written The Firebird in 2015 and 17, which was published as Playhouse in the US, one of Telegraph's best books of 2015, and a finalist at Bangalore Literature Festival, Fiction Prize, and the Mumbai Film Festival Word to Screen Market. He's also written Silverfish in 2007. He's a columnist for Outlook and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and his works appear in numerous mainstream and academic venues worldwide. I would request Professor Saikat Majumdar to introduce the speaker for today's session.
Hi, thank you all. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this great set of conversations. For any of us who are involved in the field of postcolonial studies in any capacity, scholar, writer, thinker, globalization has been an immensely important theme. I still remember the time when it sort of entered the field as a buzzword in the first decade of the 21st century, threatening to overcome everything, including postcolonial studies. That was when I was in grad school, the early to the mid years of the first decade of the 21st century. And over the years, of course, as has become very clear through the conversations today, I mean, we've come to have a much more nuanced and sort of sophisticated understanding of globalization, including ancient forms of globalization, ancient forms of migration, and kind of travel, as well as, of course, its version in late capitalist and virtual, late and virtual forms of capitalism. For me, it's actually a great honor, particularly to be part of this session led by Professor Peggy Levitt from Wellesley, a college with which I have the honor of being associated, but also because Peggy's work addresses some key questions which I have also shared a great interest in, though our archives are very different. Primarily the question of cultural and artistic migration powered by what is seen as the periphery and the center. And why does colonial modernity, why does globalization create this hierarchy of the center and the periphery? Why does some place emerge as a center, and why does some place emerge as a periphery? Has been a question that has fascinated me for a long time. And obviously I have looked at it from the work of the modernists, as well as in the present day, and as a writer myself, having lived in many different parts of the world. I mean, I have experienced this in a kind of more visceral way as well. I think what is more exciting about Peggy's work is that she is not just limited to literature. She comes at it as a social scientist, and we are always really excited when social scientists take an interest in what we do. It sort of shows that what we do really matters to the outside world. So that's always a great honor for us, even though we sometimes disagree. from their conclusions, as all healthy conversations should have. And sometimes we always cheer things on. But I think it's really exciting that she doesn't only look at literature, but she also looks at many different kinds of archives, including museum work, including visual art. And it's really fascinating for somebody who's quite limited by the written word. I mean, both in practice and theory, I engage with that somebody can really bring all these different forms together, and bring in different languages together. She not only straddles different geographical terrains, I mean, East Asia, Latin America, and sort of sees their relationship with the Anglophone, sort of post-industrial global North. But to bring it together as a comparativist is a very significant challenge. I've only been an Anglicist, a very sort of limited one at that. So I think I really admire that. So I don't want to take too much time. I want to let Peggy sort of give her version, but I'll just introduce her briefly as I have, sort of the formal introduction for her. So Peggy is the professor and chair of the Sociology department at Wellesley College. She's also an associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University, where she co-directs the Politics and Social Change workshop. She's co-founder of the Global Center and was a Robert Schuman Fellow as European University in 2017 to 19. Peggy received honorary doctoral universities from the University of Maastricht in 2014 and from the University of Helsinki. And obviously her publications, cover a wide range of this. And, I think she will bring a really interesting focus, because globalization, it's very clear, is something that defies disciplinary boundaries. Just the way it defies national boundaries, it also defies disciplinary boundaries. So we are really excited to hear from this renowned sociologist. So welcome, Peggy.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this really wonderful invitation and opportunity to be with all of you. I know you've been meeting for hours already, so I appreciate you all hanging in here with me. And Professor Majumdar, I think that I was starting this project when you were at Wellesley, and maybe we're at a presentation that I gave at the very beginning. So it's very lovely to have you here as well. So thank you very much to the organizing committee for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. My comments come from my position in the U.S. Academy, and my understanding of other parts of the world, looking out from that position. So I'm very anxious to have your feedback based on where you all are listening from. So when prospective students visit Wellesley College, the small liberal arts college in suburban Massachusetts where I teach, they feel as if they've walked into a real life version of their perfect college dream. The academic quad overlooks a sweeping lawn leading down to a picturesque lake. The 100-plus-year-old buildings that surround it are straight out of central casting for the Ivy League. And the oak trees that sit in this quad are as old and as wise as the students hope to someday become. A few years ago, when I returned from a sabbatical, our president announced that we were embarking on a strategic planning process. Committees were formed to work on governance, community, Wellesley's presence in the world outside our campus, and the liberal arts. Should a liberal arts education continue to be organized in the same way and include the same content? How could we ensure that Wellesley would survive and thrive well past our own retirements? 6 months later, the coronavirus and the anti-racism struggles across the United States thrust us into uncharted territory. In addition to adjusting to teaching online, our students called us on the carpet for the persistent structural racism that pervades our campus, despite our best efforts to address it. They called for more faculty of color and for a more diverse curriculum. They demanded that race be a central axis of our conversations, whether they be about economics, politics, culture, or sociology. Rightly so, and we are not alone. Across the United States and the world, calls for greater equity in the halls of academia, the museum gallery, and the publishing house are loud and clear. They demand more diversity and inclusion, or that the university be more globalized, internationalized, or decolonized? Why then, if everyone agrees that business as usual is no longer acceptable and that a wider range of voices need to be heard, is progress so slow? How is it that progressive institutions created as the solution are now part of the problem? The simple answer is actually quite complicated. The white Western privilege that underlies the lack of diversity in our university curricula is the product of a supply chain of exclusions that leave out a broader set of experiences at every turn. These begin when a toddler on one side of the world is surrounded by art supplies, while a toddler on the other is left empty-handed. They continue when one writer's work gets translated and circulates internationally, while the other's is read only by people back home. And they extend through the structures of the cultural and academic worlds to the halls of textbook publishing. Bringing more African-American thinkers into our curriculum, while an important first step, stops far short of addressing the deep-seated cultural and intellectual stacking of the deck. Changing what happens in the university classroom, therefore, cannot happen without changing how the knowledge that gets taught there is produced. The story of inequality in the classroom is the story of inequality in the museum and the bookstore. The institutional supply chain that connects them, or what I call the inequality pipeline, places barriers to entry for artists, writers, and thinkers who live outside the traditional centers of cultural and intellectual power at every step of the way. It's only when institutional interests converge that ideas and cultures from outside the West flow more easily to it. But that flow is inherently limited. As soon as it's strong enough to fundamentally change business as usual, the gate closes. The university, no matter how decolonized or diverse it claims to be, becomes part of the problem rather than the solution, changing the system only so much so that it stays in place. My current book project, on which this talk is based, maps that pipeline and how interests converge and diverge to allow and control what circulates through it. It tells the story of how artists and writers from Argentina, Lebanon, and South Korea negotiate their journey through the global art and literary worlds, and how and when they make it into the classroom. It's the story of producers and consumers. By that, I mean that it's not just the creators of art in culturally peripheral countries who face difficulties. It's also those of us who want to read and look at that work that have to struggle to find it. I am by no means the first to critique the global academic and cultural world. In fact, I build on the work of many incisive thinkers. For me, however, their analyses often come up short in several fundamental ways. First, they don't have a clear enough vision of how institutions produce and reproduce intellectual and cultural inequality, or of how one piece of the inequality pipeline produces inequities down the road. Second, they're often based on the idea that solving national cultural and intellectual inequalities will do the trick. But the lack of representation of artists and writers of color in US and European universities is part and parcel of the enduring colonialism that prevents writers and artists from what have been culturally peripheral countries from ever getting recognized to begin with. That is, showcasing more Latinx culture, while an important step forward, stops far short if it doesn't connect the Latinx experience inside the United States with the Latin American experience outside it. The enduring legacy of colonialism and imperialism in the region, which drove migration to begin with, persists in the global cultural pecking order that keeps Latin America in its place. Finally, and most importantly for me, many of these scholars do not suggest a way forward. It is easy to critique and really difficult to imagine and implement realistic solutions. There is, however, a growing impatience with constant deconstructing without reconstructing that I share, a deep fatigue with no but, and a yearning for yes and. So in addition to mapping the inequality pipeline and its enduring hold on universities, libraries, and museums everywhere, we also need to profile ways that people are challenging them and charting new and innovative paths forward. And I think you will share my experience of once you begin looking for something, you begin to see it everywhere. Ever since I started working on this book, I began to see articles about the lack of diversity in the publishing industry and in the museum sector every place I turned. One in particular stood out. Richard Jean So and Gus Werserek compiled a list of the English language fiction books published between 1950 and 2018 that they classified as widely read. In other words, they were available in at least 10 library collections, and that they had been published in some of the most prolific publishing houses. Their data set includes 8,000 books written by a little over 4,000 authors, of whom they could identify the race and ethnicity of 3,471. This is a quote. "We guessed that most of the authors would be white, but we were shocked by the extent of the inequality once we analyzed the data. Of the 7,124 books for which we identified the author's race, 95% were written by white people, while non-Hispanic whites make up 60% of the US population. In 2018, they wrote 89% of the books in the sample. This has to do, So and Werserek say, with who works in the publishing industry. The people in charge of the largest publishing houses are white. So are 85% of the people who acquire and edit books, according to a 2019 survey. There's a correlation between the number of people of color who work in publishing and the number of books that are published by authors of color, said Tracy Sherrod, the editorial director of Amistad, an imprint of HarperCollins that's focused on Black literature. And that's just about books published in the United States and written in English. It's hard to imagine just how hard it is for authors who do not write in English to have their words see the light of day. In the United States and the UK, translations make up only about 3% of all publications. Fiction accounts for 1% of that number. Writers lucky enough to get translated tend to be already established authors. French is the language most often translated into English, followed by German. The only Asian language on this top 10 list is Japanese. That means that Americans' literary tastes remain parochial and that the tastes of the English-speaking world disproportionately influence what ends up on the world's night tables. Likewise, few books written in non-Western languages have ever won the Nobel Prize. Between 1901 to 2017, 29 Nobel laureates wrote in English, 14 in French, 13 in German, and 11 in Spanish, compared to 2 in Chinese, 1 in Bengali, 1 in Russian, and 1 in Arabic. It's not that Arabic, Russian, Chinese, and Bengali speaking novelists are not as talented as their English and French-speaking counterparts. It's that the economics and politics of the global publishing industry work against them. The same can be said about the art world. During the last 40 years, new art markets have emerged and old ones have been transformed. According to the 2012 annual report of the European Arts Foundation, the art market grew by 757% between 1991 and 2012. That same year, the estimated worth of the market for art and antiques was 47.4 billion euros. Data on art auctions from websites like artprice.com revealed that in 2012, 11 of the 25 top-selling artists were from China, reflecting China's growing wealth and interest in patron-funding museums. Artists from India, Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey also gained greater prominence. Therefore, the global art scene includes more people from more places who are increasingly connected to one another. Nonetheless, using measures such as financial and critical rankings, sociologist Alain Kemen concludes that the most famous artists still come from the West, with Germany, the UK, and the US making up the largest share. European and US artists like Jeff Koons, Gerhard Richter, or Jean-Michel Basquiat frequently feature prominently, as do a few predictable non-Western superstars like Ai Weiwei and Elan Tansui. Again, the global art market is still dominated by artists in the global north, and the number of artists from Asia, Africa, and Latin America that manage to break through are a small, predictable group. In fact, a recent study of diversity in 18 major museums in the United States found that 85% of artists and collections are white, 87% are men, and 89% are from Europe or North America. Museums are scurrying to catch up by creating positions for diversity and inclusion aimed at not only changing what gets on the walls, but also who comes inside to see it. So what can we say about teaching art history and world literature? I'll start first with a view from the United States before turning to my research on South Korea, Lebanon, and Argentina. Now, you probably know that art historians have been hard at work trying to globalize their discipline for some time now. For over a quarter of a century, they've bemoaned how their discipline excludes white, women, minorities, and non-Western artists, along with new forms of thought such as feminism, multiculturalism, and post-colonial theory. Art historian James Elkins, for example, warned that to change the canon, the field would need to rewrite the story of art. It would not be enough to tell more local stories instead of the current broadly sweeping one if the stories were no less beholden to what used to be called dead white males. In response, many art history departments are hard at work revising their curricula, including the larger-than-life art history survey, which in many cases, introductory survey, which in many cases is the only exposure that to art history many US college students ever receive. Their current efforts are particularly fraught as the humanities tries to justify itself to consumers who increasingly question the benefits of a liberal arts education, especially at high-priced private universities. It's not enough, critics claimed, to tell a neat, simplistic, chronological story which students would simply memorize and parrot back. Complexity, critical thinking, and interdisciplinarity were sorely lacking. It's not a matter of including or excluding, but of a broadening that what we understand as the global and the art historical and what has been considered Western and non-Western. Just that little has changed. In their study of 91 institutions of higher education in the United States, Chiam and Colburn found that the discipline has yet to grapple with the pedagogical implications of building a world art history from the ground up. Their analysis of department mission statements revealed that most schools simply added non-Western content and stirred without really considering the ideologies underlying these curricular choices. The fact that they continue to use categories like non-Western attests to the fact that old binaries and exclusions still reign supreme. My colleague Kelly Rutherford and I decided to do our own analysis, and what we found is in part what prompted me to take up this book project. We analyzed various editions of the 3 principal texts used to teach the introductory art history surveys at universities in the US to get a sense of if and how the pedagogical canon of modern and contemporary art had changed over time. Some of you might have even used these books when you were in college. They include Jansen's History of Art, Stockstead and Cothran's Art History, and what is now called Gardner's Art Through the Ages, a Global Art History, which is now written by a man named Fred Kleiner. Our efforts revealed small but steady changes in what gets taught in these classes. But while how art was defined reflected a more global approach, the incorporation of non-Western artists into the telling of its story was depressingly slow. They represented only 23% of the modern and contemporary artists featured in recent editions. We also found that while the authors generally agreed about the canonical significance of particular Western, modern, and contemporary artists by the fact that they were included in multiple editions of all 3 books that we looked at, there was little consensus about which non-Western artists would ultimately have staying power. Their inclusion was more a matter of luck or caprice, reflecting the flavor of the moment or the editor's personal preferences. When we conducted a parallel analysis of the principal anthologies used in comparative literature courses throughout the country, we found greater change. There was a steady movement away from the West to the world paradigm towards the West and the rest to the current global integration paradigm. The modern era volumes or sections of the most widely used Norton, Bedford, and Longman anthologies featured a total of 175 authors. Western and non-Western writers were equally represented in these combined volumes, with 49.7% of modern writers Western and 50.3% non-Western. But while these numbers look promising, this canon of world literature is nowhere near proportional to the global population. Europe and North America make up about 15% of the world's population, but contribute just over half of the writers who make up the pedagogical canon of world literature. Asia, in contrast, constitutes 60% of the world's population, but contributes only 24% of the world's literature in these collections. And when we explored whether the authors who were featured in at least two of the texts we examined later found their way into the wider curriculum, our results were not nearly as sanguine. Our analysis of the Open Syllabus Project, which some of you might know, is a collection of over 6 million syllabi, revealed a clear pattern of teaching scores which capture how often a particular author or her work is featured on the syllabus. Both the mean and median teaching scores are considerably higher for Western writers. For the most assigned text of Western and non-Western authors, the range of teaching scores is similar, 2.5 to 98.2 for Western texts and 0 to 97.1 for non-Western texts. But the median teaching scores for Western texts is substantially higher than the median for non-Western texts, 39 versus 8.9. Only 3 non-Western texts have teaching scores greater than the Western median: Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place, and Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. The remaining 24 non-Western texts all have teaching scores less than 25. In contrast, 15 of the 22 Western texts have teaching scores greater than 25. Even when we just looked at non-Western writers featured in all 3 anthologies, who have arguably been the most canonized, the median teaching score for non-Western writers in the syllabus data reaches only 12.8 for their most assigned texts. So changes in the field of art history and comparative literature is not just about being included in these texts, but also about how the next iteration of the pedagogical canon is theorized and interpreted. Because these fields increasingly take the world as their subject, that's a tall order. While art history does this by adding diversity and stirring, or by rewriting history to stress global connection and exchange, the shift from comparative literature to world literature reflects a more fundamental reframing of what this discipline is doing and how it gets done. So what are the key takeaways from this first look at this node of the inequality pipeline? The first is the existence of this powerful pipeline. When choosing what to include in the modern and contemporary section of the art history textbook, editors are strongly influenced by the art market, by who has a solo exhibition at a major museum, by who is showing at a prominent gallery, and by whose works are getting reviewed in important newspapers and art journals. Because editors are committed to diversifying the art history story with an adequate gender and geographic balance, there's a good deal of capriciousness and subjectivity in their choices. I want to share briefly what I learned about this while talking with Fred Kleiner, who's the current sole author of Gardner's History of Art. I can make any decision I want on content, he said. The only constraints on me are when commission fees get out of control. For the 14th edition, one of the new artists I introduced in the contemporary chapter, again, no one told me to do this, I just discovered her and said this would be interesting, was an Aboriginal Australian female artist whose work looks a lot like Jackson Pollock, but is based on local fabrics created by local women. So an all-in-one artist whose work happens to be high quality, otherwise it wouldn't go into the book, no matter how politically correct it is. So I included her in the book. I wrote her into the mainstream history of art. For the 15th edition, her people wanted $5,000 to reprint. So I told the staff, tell her handlers that I'm not bluffing, that she can be written out of the history of art as easily as she can be written into it. We will pay the same fee. They refused, and she is out. Kleiner is referring to Emily Kame Ningware. He included her work because it is, in his opinion, high quality, beautiful, and combines Western and non-Western techniques and aesthetics. But by doing so, he catapulted her, albeit fleetingly, into the center of the US art history pedagogy and increased her visibility and marketability, thereby allowing her to demand much higher royalties than the next time around. The second takeaway from our research is that economic considerations prevail. The textbook industry is about making a profit. Editors' visions are constrained not only by copyright and translation costs, but by how much and what kind of change instructors are up for. In large public universities, it's often graduate students and untenured professors who teach these classes, and they have little time or incentive to creatively update their teaching. They're overwhelmed with the demands of teaching and with getting through the bureaucratic hurdles needed to make changes. That means that students at small, elite liberal arts college and universities are more likely to get a broader view because professors are expected to innovate and they get rewarded for doing so. They're also more likely to have the time and resources with which to do it. At Wellesley College, for example, we can apply for a yearly fund to update our classes along with special grants of encouraging innovative interdisciplinary pedagogy that someone teaching at a larger class with over 200 students is unable to do. This is also a global canon designed for US students. They're not necessarily, as Professor Bhagchandani, a member of the Norton Anthology of World Literature editorial team reflected, works that are well received in the country where they're created, but works chosen with the needs of US students in mind. Making decisions about what qualifies as world literature based on the needs and preferences of US audiences clearly has its dangers. Should anthologies and curricular materials canonize writers who are distinctly global in character, or should the pedagogy of world literature revolve more around works that are already canonized in their own countries? Or should anthologies also emphasize works that have been well received and part of the curriculum in their context of origin? Otherwise, the editors risk substituting American aesthetic criteria for those of other areas of the world they wish to represent, such as selecting works to please Korean American students that are not actually important in Korea. Okay. So now let me shift to what we're learning about what happens beyond the United States and Europe. My colleagues Ezekiel Saferstein, Rania Jaber, and Doyun Shin and I have begun this analysis, and I want to share some of our preliminary findings with you. We explore what's being taught in art history and comparative literature classrooms in the most important universities in our three cases, Argentina, Lebanon, and South Korea. In addition to asking what globalizing education means in each context, we consider how national history and the history of higher education, including the language of instruction and the organization of disciplines in each context, shapes our answers. We're finding that despite a broad commitment to globalizing education and to increase intellectual and academic exchanges, there are important differences in what global education actually means and how it gets implemented on the ground. It's important to note that we need to distinguish between the artists and writers that are taught as part of the course content and the works by theorists that are introduced with which to analyze and critique their work. Chen Bar-Itzhak calls the fact that most of the theories used in the fields of comparative and world literature are produced in the West a kind of intellectual captivity. Even those prominent literary theorists in the field who do come from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, she writes, are usually members of the American academic system, hence immersed in a certain academic discourse, and often have been schooled in English departments or in European languages and their literatures and thought. Thus, the epistemologies of world literature, through which literature is read and understood, still remain very much the same. In fact, according to the World Humanities Report, the internationalization of the human sciences has increased significantly in recent years, as evidenced by the growth of international networks, funding initiatives, research publications, and international rankings. The report, however, stresses the enduring centrality of academies of the United States and Europe, although it stops short of specifying the barriers to entry faced by scholars from outside these regions. What is also evidence is that peripheral intellectual production must pass through the center, whose universities, publishing houses, and journals still hold the keys to the success of the academies of the global world. Materials from the global south are included, writes Argentinian art historian Andrea Junta. It's a novelty, rarity, or exception that often presupposes the unequal power dynamics for the center. So for the purposes of time, I'm just going to focus a little bit on our findings about teaching literature. What we find is that in Argentina, literature courses are more likely to feature national and regional authors at 31 and 39% respectively, along with 24% of authors from the US and Europe. In Lebanon, 9% of the authors who are taught are Lebanese, 39% are from neighboring countries, and 36% are from the US and Europe. And in Korea, 18% are national, 32% are regional, and 41% are from the US and Europe. We find that there were very few authors from other parts of the world that are featured. The highest rates were writers from Africa and Lebanon and Latin America and Lebanon, which only accounted for 6% respectively of the materials on the syllabus. When it comes to theorists, our findings are even more striking. 51% of the theories taught in Argentina are by US and European authors, which rises to 69% in Korea and reaches 71% in Lebanon. Not surprisingly, it's the same group of theorists from so-called peripheral countries that feature prominently in all three of our cases. The most widely cited are Edward Said, followed by Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and Frantz Fanon. All of these thinkers received part of their training outside their countries of origin and are published by large prestigious publishing houses such as Penguin Random House and Planeta. I don't have time to go into much detail about what explains our findings. What I will say is that what the work of globalizing education is meant to do and whose interests it serves differs significantly across our cases. In Korea, it's part of a government-mandated strategy to internationalize higher education as part of Korea's drive to be a more prominent economic and geopolitical power on the world stage. At least among decision makers, there's little concern about decolonizing the curriculum. The distribution of materials in Argentina reflects what literature scholar Mariano Siskine calls the country's parochial cosmopolitanism. There are more national materials featured here because of the country's strong history of intellectual and cultural pride, which until recently also unabashedly celebrated its European origins. There's also a strong focus on the cultural production of the region, which reflects the power of the widely recognized aesthetic and geographic label Latin American literature. In Lebanon, there's simply a paucity of scholarship written by national authors about national literature and art. The good news is that this is changing as a new generation of scholars takes up the cause. Now I'm moving towards my conclusion. I could have organized this talk around any node of the pipeline. In other words, I could have discussed how the weak infrastructure and unsettled topography of the literary and artistic fields in Argentina, Lebanon, and South Korea impede the circulation and recognition of most artists and writers. Those who do circulate outside the linguistic and cultural region have usually migrated to study and work abroad, and therefore their social networks include people and institutions closer to the centers of power. I could have told you about the role of the cultural armature of cities, how history, demography, and longstanding values about who the residents of a city think they are influence the number of resources dedicated to cultural production and what kind. I could have talked to you about the importance of national and urban cultural policy and how South Korea is way ahead of the game because the government supports the production and export of culture as a way to gain a more prominent geopolitical place. I'm happy to say more about all of these things during our discussion. But let's return to where we began. We began how to address cultural and intellectual inequality and what kinds of new institutional arrangements we would want to create to remediate them. As I said earlier, too much of our scholarly conversation involves deconstruction and not enough reconstruction, or charting new, potentially positive ways forward. And this is a challenge with many parts. As we begin to produce different kinds of knowledges, they're still being organized and disseminated into old boxes. They still have to fit into the established sections of the textbook, the library, or the bookstore. They still need to fit within the structures of the curriculum, the discipline, or the university. But the desperately needed knowledge at the intersection often has no place to go or falls through the cracks. Young scholars who want to produce it run the risk of sidetracking their careers because they will not perform according to the established recognizable metrics or incentive structures. At the very least, we need to train students to recognize the power of these curatorial choices, what they see and value when they go into a museum or a library or an archive results from a set of choices made by human beings with interests and preferences about how the space is organized, how the categories are structured in relation to each other, etc. But what we really need is new categories, disciplines and textbooks that accept and acknowledge the complicated messiness of the human experience and recognize from the outset how trying to make it neat and orderly can diminish our understanding of social life. Remaking categories means remaking the institutions that create them. That is the hardest but most important question of all. I'm convinced that universities should be organized differently, but everything is stacked against that. The vested interests behind the current organization of knowledge production mitigate against easy change. The journals we publish in, the foundations that fund our research, and the prizes that recognize our accomplishments are all based on the old categories. Few people are brave or humble enough to start a conversation with a new fan club when they're already so famous and comfortable in the one to which they currently belong. Still, we must reconstruct as well as deconstruct. We must convene conversations between scientists, social scientists, and humanists. We must create international journals that go beyond Europe and the United States. We want high impact journals, not just to be written in English and to be available to everyone. And I think this is part of what you're trying to do here with this conference. I believe that researchers who follow ideas, things, or groups across different sites and the connections between them have taken an important step forward. Others who look at how people and objects are integrated into different types of networks that span spaces and scales have too. Fruitful conversations involving scholars from different disciplines that are organized around particular problems such as climate change or criminal justice reform can also be extremely fruitful. But what also has to change is what we call exemplary scholarship. Analyses produced by experts who study one topic or who study countries and regions for long periods of time are very important. We need people with deep linguistic, cultural, and historical fluency. But in today's world, we also need deep analyses of different places that illuminate the broad social patterns they share, or what Richard Wilk called structures of common difference. Writer Tony Jute, in an homage to Isaiah Berlin, described himself in one of his last books as decidedly not a hedgehog. I have no big theory of contemporary European history to propose in these pages, he wrote. No single all-embracing story to tell. It doesn't mean, he goes on to say, that European history has no thematic shape. Rather, fox-like Europe knows many things. For us, Jute makes an important methodological point. We also need accounts that are more fox-like, which do not pretend to capture every detail of the places they describe, but that produce valuable insights precisely because they see the forest and the trees and the patterns that connect them. This approach, not surprisingly, is imperfect. To do it right, you have to be clear about what you can and what you can't claim based on your findings. to own up to what you know and cannot know. You have to do your homework depending upon the hedgehogs in a particular field and trying to read in languages you might not speak. You can't be a cowboy ethnographer who gallops in on a high horse, believing it's possible to see everything quickly and easily from your saddle. But most importantly, you must proceed with great humility, asking colleagues to guide and accompany you along the way. In music, writes Barbara Tomlinson and George Lipsitz, to accompany other players entails more than simply adding new sounds to the mix. Accompaniment means attention, communication, and cooperation. It means augmenting, accenting, and countering one music voice with another. It means doing the hard work of creating a far-reaching, truly international network of professionals, scholars, and friends who will support your work and living a much richer social and intellectual life as a result. So thank you very much.
Much for that really admirable and wide-ranging talk. I mean, you brought up something that is of deep concern to us working in the field of arts and humanities, ideological and aesthetic importance. But I think what is particularly admirable is that you brought the social scientists' precision and methodological sort of rigor, especially the data that you present is really, really useful. I will just make a couple of very brief comments, and then I think there will be questions which we can open up to. I really admired your beginning this discussion with reference to U.S. universities and what is going on there, and the decolonizing curriculum which is happening now in the US as well as in the UK. The thing is, though, I mean, you mentioned that these were institutions which were created for inclusion, but the fact is, if you look at their history, especially their complicity with institutions like slavery, I think we do get a very different picture in mind. I think the Brown University sort of scandal is very well known. Recently, there was a debate at Stanford about Stanford getting rid of its one Cantonese lecturer. And, it's particularly ironical given the fact that Stanford was partly built on the labor of the railroad workers who were primarily Cantonese speaking. So it's kind of this historic repetition of, so I guess the point is the complicity of the US university with forms of oppression in the past often seamlessly leads into its co-option into more neoliberal forms of capital, which is, I think, of course, faculty and administration are always at sort of an odds here. Administration, faculty tends to be on the left, but administration and trustees, and this is true of the world over. It's not just the US. I mean, we have the same thing here. So, I mean, of course, one can't even begin to talk about question of academic freedom in India right now. So that's a whole other, So that's something I was just going to my head. It's not particularly a question. The other thing I just want to briefly mention was I'm very glad that you did talk about the archival exclusion of a non-Western material, but you didn't just stay at that. You mentioned ideological exclusion and aesthetic exclusion as well. I think this is really important. This is also something which historians have talked about for a long time. I think, Dipesh Chakraborty talks about how it's not just enough to expand the archives, but we need to epistemically challenge certain disciplines. And I think particularly since I'm sort of very concerned with the field of literature in various capacity, it just struck me that the West is comfortable with certain narratives from the non-West if they subscribe to their version of what the non-West looks like. And I think the simplest version of that is if you just read the New York Times. If you just read the New York Times, you get a picture. And in fact, specifically, I've been subscribing to the coronavirus pandemic, coronavirus newsletter, and it's striking that how only the horror stories, and there are enough horror stories, of course. So sort of feature in there. And I think the term often used by writers and critics, it's kind of a rough term, but I think I have to sort of open it up here, is the term poverty porn, or variously trauma porn. Poverty porn and trauma porn are the things that are expected when it comes from Africa, or for that matter, other parts of the world, or Asia, South Asia. It's really, kind of, that's what is expected, whereas stories of middle class lives or other forms of regional identities are simply not necessity. So I think what we have here to overcome is not merely an archival, but an epistemic barrier, which is very hard because the news media is constantly buttressing, and it becomes a vicious cycle that okay, there's no public for it because we don't tell those stories, but because we don't tell the stories, there's no public for it. So it's a kind of an unsolvable thing. So anyway, these are just sort of loose thoughts. I don't think you need to respond to that, I mean, unless you want to, but maybe we can move to other questions that we have. So this is a good time, maybe I can invite other people. I already see some questions on the chat, but I think it might be interesting if people actually spoke their questions. I think it'll be nice to hear other voices. So may I call upon...
If it's possible to save the questions in the chat so I can think about them afterwards.
Okay, perfect. Let's do that. Why don't we save the questions, and let's see if somebody would like to speak, maybe they can just send an exclamation mark here or raise the hand.
Saikat, if I can just intervene.
Yes.
Since there are already people who have posed the questions, and obviously they've thought about these questions, maybe our rapporteurs can probably read out those questions for Professor Levitt, and she can respond to them. And meanwhile, if there are other people who want to speak, then they can raise their hands and we can collect those as well.
Okay, sure. That's the way to go. So let them do that.
Thank you. The first question that I see here is from Professor Miriam Walraven, and she says, thank you for this important talk. The situation very much evokes the political and academic fight against the virtual exclusion of women from the production of knowledge from the 1970s onwards in literature at academia. I think we can learn a lot from these attempts of creating equality. This is still not fully achieved and constantly threatened by backlash. So that's more of a comment, and if Professor Levitt would want to comment on it.
Let's take a few. I totally agree with that.
Okay, okay. The next one is by Abhishek Pundir, and that's a longish comment. And if you can see that in the chat box, I'm reading it out now. The syllabus taught under Indian cinema, literature, and Indic religions repeatedly have the same texts, Ritvik Ghatak, Prem Chand, and Advaita Vedanta, to quote some examples. Often, I strongly feel that Indian scholars and scholarship is complicit in keeping scholarship in these fields archaic and parochial. And sometimes only a kind of scholarship, representation through certain authors and texts, gets patronized and welcomed in Western academia. Which continues to influence South Asian studies. It does influence research done in South Asia, so much so. I wonder what happens to the whole project of decolonizing. You mentioned the need of high impact journals in non-European languages, and insidious politics of what makes a journal with high impact remains an issue to be resolved. Yeah.
I agree. I think we need a kind of multi-pronged strategy here. The first is to, as I said, teach ourselves and our students to read the power in space. So to look at the textbook not as a given, but to really think critically about how it is a cultural object created under conditions of power that reflect certain interests and certain sacralization of certain kinds of materials and not. And that's not just reading the power in the textbook, it's reading the power in the museum gallery, or when you go to the bookstore and the works are organized in a certain way, etc. And the same thing with the journal, that the commenter made an important point, which is it's not transparent how evaluations are made and how impact factors are created and go up and down, and whether that's even a reasonable metric to be using for visibility. I myself don't read them, but I can do that because I'm at a later stage in my career. So I think we need, sort of short-term, medium-term, and long-term vision. And a lot of what I think about is what to do in the short term, which has to do with not only a critical receiving of materials, but also developing a kind of attitudinal reflexiveness that that is the ethos of how we engage with each other. That is more equitable, respectful, humble listening that starts to eat away at the kind of toxic interactions that often color knowledge production and knowledge dissemination.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm looking at the next one, which is by Professor Suborno Chatterjee. And he says, the inequality pipeline is a reality and problematic when we think about rationality from a Western perspective. Would a change of perspective help in rethinking inequality? For instance, there is a robust ecology of translation from one Indian language to another. There is exemplary scholarship in non-English languages. Perhaps scholars and writers and artists in the non-West need to think of their work within local contexts as being of equal value to the Western ones, without falling into nativism or parochialism.
Agreed. In this book, I'm not assuming first that every writer or artist that I meet wants to circulate to what has been a global center of power. It's an empirical question. And in fact, there are a significant number of people that are rewriting the topography of power or opting out of it by redefining success in a different way. Now, whether that's economically viable remains to be seen, whether something that's called alternative at one point gets co-opted by the mainstream, often seems to happen. I'm not sure how to make sense of that line or that process, but what I am seeing is that there are a lot of alternative responses to getting visibility, getting recognition, to circulating. So let me give you a concrete example. In Argentina, there's a very vibrant independent publishing sector. And some of those are, kind of vanity projects, like I'm an intellectual, I love books, I'm going to publish these 4 books a year. But some of them have gotten to be sort of mid-level publishing companies that really want to make sure that in order for a book to circulate within Latin America, it doesn't have to go first to Spain to get to Mexico from Argentina. And they're trying to develop different pathways, often, and it's an explicitly decolonizing project. And they're getting some help by what's happening in the United States, which is a kind of, in their quest to become more diverse, there's more resources for books by Latinx writers or art by Latinx artists. And so some of these alternative publishing houses or museum exhibit spaces are getting help from by collaborating and creating this sort of Latin United States circulation that is, like not interested in Europe anymore. That's not where we want to be. And who knows if that's a permanent position or a temporary position, but I really see it happening in lots of parts of the world. So this is something that we have to pay attention to, about new models for circulation and recognition and what it means to be successful.
Professor Walraven, if you would want to speak, please go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly, because thank you. And that's what I meant by we can probably really learn something from the history of feminism. That a lot of people don't pay attention to still at university, because I think there are alternative models coming from the bottom up. But we as academics have to pay attention to that. So for example, the women's presses, I'm talking about the UK now, they have made such an influence, starting as a women's press with all the criticism like this is separatist, oh, it's women's topic, which have influenced the mainstream so much in the Western world now. This is something I think we have to pay attention to as academics. Small presses, different models, different translations. We just have to be aware of that, because I think a lot of us, we're teaching texts that are widely available from the major presses. But I think we can also look at models in like feminist fights that didn't work, and check them out, because especially in Germany, like the women's bookshops didn't work. They are all closed. They did all die because no one actually went there after the kind of 90s. So not all things bottom up work, but it needs the visibility and the attention. I think we can learn a lot from the feminist publishing houses. I'm thinking about the publishers of Margaret Atwood, right? We're really thinking about how the marginal, the special comes into the mainstream, but we have to pay attention to that. And I see that a lot of academics just don't do that yet. So we have to be aware of that, I think, which is just adding to that. But I think we've been through that history and maybe can check what works, because we are not only the readers, but we are also the teachers. Thank you very much for your work. It's really important.
I know it's late for you all, right? 9:30. What time?
If we could quickly take one last question by Professor Yasmin Arif. And she says, thank you, Professor Levitt. Perhaps the problem continues to be the binary West/non-West, which dominates the discussion, where even the critique is produced by the West. Power producing hierarchies are everywhere, but the fact remains that the West knows and writes the rest, whereas the native is expected to know only the native. That continues to be the dominant model. So what kind of critique can we really expect?
Agreed. All of these are, very fair, very, I agree. I guess my only answer is what we can each do from our positions and with the resources that we have available to us. So one of my main projects now is to try to create this network called the Global D Center. And it is to, I saw Arnab is here, he's part of it. It is to bring together in a truly international way people who care about producing and disseminating and teaching about and acting on knowledge in more inclusive ways. And that means, organizing things and helping people who have different abilities to write in English, if that's the language that we end up having to use, or different styles of writing, academic arguments, or, taking or even having conversations with people who aren't able to express themselves as well as all of us can on this, to have the patience and the commitment and the, responsibility to make those communications possible, and then to bring scholarship and theories and insights from underheard parts of the world to greater prominence. And all of us have different tools with which to do that, different amounts of time, different resources. So we all have to just do it in our own way. And for me, that's really trying to create an interdisciplinary, not just US and European network. And it's hard. And Zoom makes it a lot easier because we can be together like today. And I hope that I hope that I can think about those who put questions in the chat. I really am grateful for them. I really want to hear how what I said resonates with all of you from wherever you're sitting. I'd love you to send me an email and continue the conversation and perhaps figure out ways we can do this important work together. So thank you all for the invitation and the opportunity.
Thank you. That was really, really good conversation, a very important conversation. So I'm glad we are part of this. So over to you, organizer Simi.
Thank you, Professor Levitt. Thank you, Professor Majumdar. Thanks a lot for this wonderful talk on cultural and artistic migration and the global academic world. We're running short of time, and there's still a few comments and questions in the chat box. Maybe you can write to Professor Levitt later and connect with her on this. We're going to take a break for 10 minutes and meet at 8:15 for the next session now.
Right. So